Dennis, welcome.
Thank you.
Sorry I'm behind you, but I've just got the rest of the piece of paper and something, so I can make sure I get the bio absolutely perfect. For those of you who don't know Denis, he grew up in Brisbane, Queensland, in a traditional Catholic family, and academia was a part of his family life. He then attended Downlands College for 2 years before going to the Apostolic School at Douglas Park for his final year of secondary school and on to novitiate and studies for the priesthood. Denis was ordained in 1967 and has spent most of the following 40 years in MSC schools, and I think Chevalier, is Chevalier the only one you have, mate?
I was at chair, first place.
Say that again?
I was a chair of first appointment.
First appointment was
Taught there, but not principal there.
Not
principal everywhere else.
Principal in the other three schools, Monterey, Darabara and Downlands. Denis taught history, English and religious education, and if you're as lucky as I am to have him wander into your room periodically and sit down just as he did a minute ago and say, oh, I've just been listening to this, it's very interesting. Denis is a wonderful, wonderful thinker. He can read, he can distill, he can synthesise, he can come back and put wonderful ideas into very simple language, and I'm very grateful that I'm the recipient of some of those ideas. But we know that his great passion is history, and these will get, I know we'll get, I've heard what he has to say before, and it's wonderful. I'm very, very happy to be hearing it again. As he presents his topic today, from devotion to spirituality, MSC and the heart tradition, that wonderful depth of knowledge about history makes its presence felt. So Denis, we welcome you and look forward to your words of wisdom.
Thank you. Keep going. I suppose where I began is a bit abstract. It seems to me there are three movements in religious response to the world we live in, or whatever it is. The first one is we're living in a world we don't control, we don't understand, and we want magic as our solution to the problems because we don't understand them. And that's probably most of human history, depending how far back you want to go. You're familiar, as I understand it, the earliest religion that they can find is the the worship of the Great Mother, and that makes perfect sense, to do with birth and whatever around them. It wasn't until they began to settle that the male gods started to get mentioned, and these are to do with warfare, conquest, power, the things that chaps are still interested in. And when you move from the magic one into the next phase of religion is to do with rules. And if I do these things, God owes me, whoever the God happens to be. So, for example, if your God was Moloch, you would sacrifice your children, perhaps. And if you did that, then Moloch had to defend you and make sure that your city was safe. If it wasn't, well, you got another one. You go for the one that works. And the next phase, which is further down the track, and one we're still wrestling with, is that you move into relationship with the God. It becomes a personal conviction and commitment, which perhaps to link it with what's just gone by, which transforms you, which you then try to become the child of the God, if I can put it in that language. So if we're looking at moving to relationship, and we're looking at a heart approach, without having to do the arithmetic, You can do it if you want to. It's only, it's arithmetic. The scriptures constantly use the word heart, something like 1,200 times. Someone counted them. And heart here is the seat of intelligence and decision making. To set the heart is to focus your attention. To say in the heart is to think. Now, this language emerged because there was a movement bigger than the Jewish world. And some scholars call it the first Axial period. It's the shift from magic into something more personal. Maybe rules, it may be whatever. And this happened from about 800 BC through to about at least 300 BC across most of the world. Happened in China with Confucius, he wasn't religious, but the thing was you took personal responsibility. You didn't hang it on the gods. It happened with the Buddha. He wasn't religious either, which is interesting. But again, it was you took responsibility. It wasn't that you could just ignore it. It happened with Zoroaster. Probably the one you know best, it happened with the Hebrew prophets. And I was trying to think for quite some time, why did the prophets stop about 300 or 400 BC? And I think I came to the conclusion that they'd done their job. In a sense, you start with the Jews think of God as magic. Think of Moses and the chaps. If you ever get the chance, read the Jewish story in Exodus and so on, with the character Yahweh. He's superb. One of the great characters in literature. If God will forgive me saying all this. He can be expansive and generous. He can be mean and nasty. He can be belting them for offending him. They had to grow through that. But if you take at it just as a character, as someone did, as a literary character, it's brilliant. One of the great ones in literature. And that image had to be changed. And here's where you get people like Isaiah and Ezekiel and co, who come down with a much more sense of a personal response to God. As they say at some stage, it doesn't matter what your fathers did or your children do, it's your heart that matters. That's not literally translated. And this is where the Jews get challenged. And that's how they actually do it. And Jesus is obviously in this tradition. You even have my old mate Socrates. The Greeks are moving from the gods into a human world where we're responsible for ourselves. So Socrates, I can't think of Tim Kelly's thing he gave us a long time ago. Something like an old man who went around asking awkward questions, which is not a bad description of Socrates. Like Jesus, he wrote nothing that we know of. Like Jesus, we pick up Socrates from different writers and they present different images of him. But the one we know best is Plato, who presents Socrates as entering into dialogue, and it was dangerous to enter into dialogue with Socrates. It was so easy to begin, and then he just keeps sharpening the questions. And if you ever read some of the dialogues, they're great. But that was part of what they call the first Axial period, because they've noticed the same pattern of things happening over a huge swathe of human beings. When we look at the New Testament, the image of Jesus, and look at the early Roman times, the image of Jesus is the Good Shepherd more than any other. I was looking at a thing yesterday in a bookshop that had a casket with a carving of Jonah on it. which was probably Jesus for 3 days. They dug it up recently in Jerusalem. But you won't find anything to do with a crucifixion or a cross. Not until crucifixion was outlawed and no one knew what it was like. When Jesus was a boy, the Roman army went through Galilee seriously. If there was any timber in Nazareth, which is probably unlikely, it would have been burnt. The houses, which were probably mud brick, would have been stomped on. Sepphoris was burnt to the ground. 3,000 were crucified. They were left on the crosses until the bodies rotted, with the local dogs chewing parts of them and the crows getting the rest. It's not nice. So while people knew that, and everyone had seen it, there was no representation of Jesus crucified. Oh, there's one drawing of the thing with the whatchamacallit. They would have had no objection to it, but I've never seen reference to it. Normally they were sold off. They probably considered them more useful. So in Jesus we have someone who challenges our goodness rather than imposes rules. I suppose as a digression, it's important to remember that Jesus was born and remained till he died a Jew. His followers were all Jews. Christianity didn't emerge until 60 or 70 years later, at least, if not longer. So it's looking at history backwards to say that Jesus founded the church, but that's perhaps semantics more than anything else. Paul says we have come to believe in God's love for us. So in the person of Jesus, Paul sees God's commitment to the human family, and therefore the love that God has for all of us, and how we respond to that then becomes the challenge of our lives. So all of this is sort of background to some extent to what we're looking at. We talk about devotion. Some of you are too young to know the devotions, aren't you? Blast. Because it was really important. We grew up taking for granted that he was a hard God. They've made some wonderful plays and stuff on that old Irish framework of the hard God. And devotion was a way of softening something of the hardness of religion. If you missed Mass on Sunday, you went to hell. Bingo. It didn't matter what else you've done. It didn't matter that God would sort of, as it were, pat you on the back and invite you in and so on, and if you chose not to, he'd throw you in the oven. Now, that's a horrible image of God that doesn't really glue together. But that was the one we had. And probably most people still have. And a lot of people, when they reject religion, they've grown up enough to reject that, but they don't know what to replace it with. That's their problem, and ours. So, one of the most famous ones, of course, was a devotion to Mary. She was the softness of God. While God was pushing people out and punching them in the face over here because they're not obeying the rules, Mary's putting down a ladder and bringing them up on the other side. Are you familiar with that image? It's wonderful. It's terrible in terms of theology, but it's very human. And therefore, she was, again, seen as, again, if you look at what was a Roman paterfamilias, he was the hard God. That's the image of stuff they'd come from. Technically speaking, if the Roman father didn't accept the child and hold it up and claim it, you'd throw it in the rubbish bin. There's a marvellous letter written in Egypt from a husband to his wife. And It got found by accident in one of those places. And he's working in Alexandria, I think, or Cairo, I'm not sure where, and she's back at the farm or whatever it was. And he's saying to her, look, I'm delighted you're pregnant. Now, if it's a boy, of course we're going to keep it. If it's a girl, throw it away. Now, that's, again, the culture from which they're coming. So the devotion to Mary was the classic one. She was the softness that could, in a sense, intercede for God. I mean, why anyone has to intercede for a God who totally loves us, I have no idea. But that's why that one, Jesus sitting on the right hand of the Father, interceding with the Father, I find that blasphemy. But leaving that aside, most people are quite happy with it. Other things we had, for example, if you lost something, you prayed to St. Anthony. And you found it, more often than not, which convinced you that St. Anthony was around. Leaving aside magic, there are probably simpler explanations of calming yourself down and tracing back and so on. But anyhow, Jude was the hope of the hopeless. Why poor old Jude copped that, I have no idea. But there'll be something behind it. Are you familiar with the things of getting souls out of purgatory? The 5 Saturdays? That was cheaper than the 9 Fridays. So I thought, yeah, except getting up on Saturday was tougher. So these are the sorts of things we talk about as devotions, which build us up some sort of capital with God that you could bargain with. We had the saints busy interceding and acting. Oh dear. The saints are really the minor Roman gods, aren't they? What we've really done is to turn paganism into a more acceptable religion. Of course, we can have statues and all sorts of things. And because of the incarnation, as we call it, therefore you can have statues the way the Romans had statues of the gods, whereas the Jews couldn't have them. That probably won most of the people over. And so instead of having your local god, it became Saint so-and-so. Very clever. Don't fight them, infiltrate them. Take them over from the inside. So this meant that we belonged to a club and which had rituals of belonging. Like, you're familiar with no fish on Friday? No meat on Friday? You miss everything. So when we were growing up, it was very clear Catholics did not have, good Catholics did not eat meat on Friday. It was verboten. And that, in a sense, singled you out and gave you a bit of muscle in the broader community because you had to bear people laughing at you or whatever. People travelling by train. I mean, the one thing you wanted was a pie. It was the only thing they had that was edible. But you couldn't have that. And technically, if you were travelling, you could, but don't tell anyone. That was a rule most people didn't know. So when we're looking at these devotions, one of the ones that emerged, because it didn't start off as a devotion, was the Sacred Heart. And that's what we're looking at here. We're familiar with it as coming from Margaret Mary, more than anyone else. A nun in the Visitation Order in the 17th century in France. But she didn't begin it. She popularised it. That's a bit of a lie. She enabled it to be popularised. She was stuck in a convent, she couldn't do much. But there were people in the Middle Ages who had this devotion to the heart of Jesus. People like Gertrude and Mechtilde and Catherine of Siena offering her heart to Jesus. This was a little small professional religious group, if I can call them that, who, I don't know whether they even knew each other was doing it. But it was their commitment to God that probably led them to this image of heart. By the 16th century, it was starting to spread beyond religious houses. You had people like John Eudes, particularly Francis de Sales, who were quite openly talking about devotion to the Sacred Heart. And de Sales then began the visitation convents with hearts all over them. And it's not an accident that Margaret Mary, through the visitations, with this 100-year tradition of the Sacred Heart, because of her peculiar temperament, began to see visions. Now, if anyone tells you you're seeing visions, be very wary. It says a lot about you, but not necessarily good. Certain temperaments are more likely to have them. When Margaret Mary was a girl, she carved the name of Jesus on her chest, like most people do. That was before they had tats. When she asked to go to the convent and mother said no, she was paralysed for 4 years. Now, that tells you something about an imagination out of control. At least I find that anyhow. If someone told me I couldn't have gone, I would have shot off like a Bondi tram. So you have this peculiar person, if I can call it that, who's in a Sacred Heart convent and who starts to see visions of Jesus. Now, she saw Jesus as the paintings of the day would have predicted him. Take that for granted. So around 1673 to 75, she had visions of Jesus showing his heart. She thought visions were normal. She had plenty of them. And the Jesus that she saw was, again, in this very much devotion to the heart of Jesus. It wanted reparation, whatever that means. Making up for the sufferings of Jesus. Now, there's snippets like that in Paul, but she takes it perhaps more literally. You have to go back to Anselm, don't you? 1098, Cura Deus Homo. At the most, it should have been burnt before it was written. Are you familiar with Anselm's theory about redemption? You are, but you don't know it, that's all. Because notice that Anselm comes at the time when the Middle Ages were just emerging. When the theory of knightly response was emerging. And he uses that language. He picks it up partly from Augustine, who talks about original sin. Again, one of the doctrines that perhaps would have been better not to have been created, but that's where they were. They had to start with Adam and Eve and co, because they had nowhere else to start. So Anselm took the original sin thing and said, look, if we have insulted God, then God the great, the infinite, has been insulted by us useless human beings. There's no way we can make reparation for that. You need someone who's infinite, equal to God, like the king and the prince. See the language? If a knight is insulted by a peasant, the peasant can't make reparation, he's vulgar. Literally. You need another knight to do it. So he's in that social language, and because they lived it, they didn't think twice about it, as far as I can see. So that's why Jesus had to go down, had to get, it was such an infinite thing, you needed blood reparation. So he gets executed in reparation so God can stop being angry with the world. God can now pretend to smile. And this is the theory that's lasted through to our own day. And I suspect most people listen to radio, listen to the things, and most of them will talk that language. No wonder we get pilloried, but there are other ways of interpreting it, as you probably know. But that's, Margaret Mary's within this tradition. So for her, reparation means there's still that you've got to share in the sufferings of Jesus, make him feel good about what he's doing by being there for the holy hour or whatever, so he can feel better. And look how lonely he is up there in the host. So you've got to go there and make him feel better. You have the 9 First Fridays, which is a systematic way of offering reparation, which gets payback. You get out of purgatory on the next First Friday, whoopee. Mary beats it by, I think you're out on the next Saturday. You don't have to wait for the first Saturday, but I'm hazy on that. So the reparation, consecration, the holy hour for consoling, they create the feast day, and look at the language of the feast day, the vote of Mass, the litany of the Sacred Heart, consecration of families, enthronement of the Sacred Heart. It became big business. It spread from the convent through the Jesuits, and they have become, for most of the time, the great proponents of Sacred Heart stuff. Because Claude de Colombière was her confessor, and he made her write it up and all this sort of stuff. And then he went as a confessor to the Queen of England, I think it was, who was French. And he then wrote to other Jesuits, and they had schools everywhere. They had preachers everywhere on the front line. They were confessors in the power game to most of the kings of Europe, the Catholic ones. So they were in positions to make the Sacred Heart popular. The nuns in the convent were making Sacred Heart banners and sending them around to their friends. So it became known very quickly. By 1720, which is sort of 50 years after Margaret Mary, there was a plague in Marseilles which they didn't have to have. Great for those who died from it. They had a system where if a ship had come from plague areas, which was nearly everywhere, it had to stop at this island for 30 days until, well, we'd say all the rats had got off and the fleas and all the rest of it, but until plague had stopped. Then it was meant to come into the city. For reasons that people don't quite understand, one ship was brought in almost immediately. And hello, plague broke out in Marseilles, hundreds dying each day. Bubonic. It's not nice. So what they did, the bishop there made a public consecration of Marseilles to the Sacred Heart, had processions up and down the beachfront, the shipping area and so on. And you're not going to believe this, the plague stopped. Well, it was about the right time for the plague to stop, but don't tell the bishop that. It has its phase. And by 1740, there were 700 Sacred Heart confraternities in France. That makes it reasonably popular. Its political impact started to emerge as the Jesuits were urging the king to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Let's start again. Let's, a sign of loyalty to God and to France, let's consecrate France to the Sacred Heart and do the religion thing properly. They had theories that France was the new chosen people, the Franks, that Clovis, the king, was the new David. Well, the Russians had a parallel thing. They were the New Jerusalem, and so on. So there is this sort of surging in the background. I mean, Louis XIV quietly ignored it. As you expect Louis XIV to quietly ignore anything that impinged upon his sovereignty. Louis XV was too busy with his friends, female, to take much notice of it. Louis XVI would like to have done it. Perhaps not today, but we'll certainly, we'd like to do that. And that's half where the trouble's going to come from. So France moves along with its disaster looming. This has nothing to do with religion as such, but it's tied in the background. You're familiar with the French Revolution broadly? No one set out to have a revolution. What happened was the government was broke. Now, not the country, the government. A bit like Australia's government at the moment. It's broke, but the country's doing quite well. The king had brought in half a dozen finance ministers to fix it. None of them could, because there was no way the government could raise the funds for the spending of the crown. Military spending mainly. They were in wars for about 100 years at a time. And war was starting to get pretty expensive. Nothing like the expense it is today. But they had cannon, they had rifles. It's a lie, they had muskets. You won't get rifles to the American Civil War, and that's why the bloodshed's much bigger, because they're much more accurate and they go much further. A musket goes about 100 metres if you're lucky, and could even be within a yard of your target, either way. Whereas a rifle will go 1,000 yards, if not 2, and because of the rifling, it remains accurate. Anyhow, so they decide the only way to solve it is to call some sort of assembly. England had a parliament that it used to work through, corrupt most of the time, but they had a parliament. France had nothing unless you went way, way back to what's called the Estates General. There were 3 estates in France. You belonged to either the nobility, either powerful or weak, you belonged to the church, bishop or priest, or you belonged to the middle class. Peasants don't count. That would make up perhaps 10% of the population, perhaps less. So in desperation, they decided to call one. They sent out, this is pretty brave, what they call cahiers, exercise books, to call it every village, that'll do, or town, to draw up a list of things that they were not happy with. And they had plenty of those. What the peasants wanted was to own their land. What the nobles wanted was to stop being taxed and live happily. What the church wanted was the status quo, because they were powerful. I mean, the church owned a quarter of France, given to them over 1,000 years. Out of that, they were meant to run schools and hospitals and whatever. Some of it got to the schools and hospitals. A lot of it got to the bishops, who lived in huge palaces and may even have been religious, but they probably weren't. Of course, the nobles wanted their sons to own that property so that it become part of the family. That won't surprise anyone. If you go back to Jesus' day, the high priests owned a fair bit of the land, and all that money went to them, plus all the tithes that were taken went to them. Oh, they didn't want any change in the status quo. No wonder they executed Jesus. So this assembly, the nobles voted for their own, and the priests and bishops voted for their own, and they formed mainly, all the bishops got in, of course, and quite a lot of the priests, particularly the parish priests. The nobles got in according to their rank, and they had, by compromise, twice the number in the commons, we'll call it, to use English terms. These are the well-off middle class. Property owners, lawyers particularly, accountants, doctors, perhaps even teachers, but I doubt it. They had about 500 odd, to the others 250 each, something in that order. My arithmetic won't be exact, but it's of the order. And they all met in Paris. I forget to tell you the voting system. Each estate had one vote, which they worked out among themselves. Nobles had one vote, the clergy had one vote, the commons had one vote. Guess how the king expected it to go? 2 to 1, 2 to 1, 2 to 1 on anything that was put up for voting. Back to the status quo. But miracles can happen. The lower clergy, the priests, decided that this was unfair. And so they went and took in their place with the third estate. poor old bishops had to follow suit, looking as though they were happy. The nobles then had no choice but to do the same. And this is the origin of the National Assembly, where each person gets one vote. What started off as a lay-down misère has suddenly gone into danger territory, unknown. The system started off with high mass and processions. On memory, Robespierre carried a cross. Might be symbolic later. But it was all because it was an officially Catholic country. So they got to the stage then where they had to solve the financial problem. And the proposition was that the church lands become public property, sold off, and that money go to paying the government's debts and supporting the clergy as public servants. Well, economically, that was fine, but it's going to cause a rift which still hasn't been healed in France. A rift between those who think that's the best thing since sliced bread, which hadn't been invented then, or those who think this is a betrayal of France's tradition. A lot of the parish priests voted for it. None of the bishops voted for it, surprise. None of the nobles voted for it, surprise. But there are enough votes to get it through. And this then becomes a public issue of major emotional impact. There are parts of France that think this is horrible. There are parts of France, mainly Paris, who think this is wonderful. Don't think of France as one country at this stage as we do today. It was Paris surrounded by provinces who were still pretty old-fashioned. I think the First World War was what brought France together, particularly conscription. I mean, really, I don't mean technically. So, murmurings start to happen on particularly the western provinces of France, who think the church has been betrayed, who think that God has been betrayed, and this irreligious group of people need to be thrown out. And so you have what's called the War of the Vendée. The badge of those who resisted the National Assembly was the badge of the Sacred Heart. If you resisted it, you had the badge. And they were producing them like crazy and sending them out to people. And they start to raise, what would you call it? I was looking at a thing last night on the last battle in the Highlands. It would have been similar to that. You had the chaps from the Glens who came out against the serried ranks of the British Army and that was actually won by the mortar. Fascinating. Which they just invented. And you would fire the shot, the steel, up into the air, and it would explode, as good mortars do, above the people on the ground. Anyhow, so these would be full of energy, full of desire, but not organised. In their tribes or whatevers. And so eventually they got defeated. Anyone who had a Sacred Heart badge was executed. If you were a priest, you were automatically executed. 10,000 of them got executed around that time. 10,000 fled to England, and about the equivalent number fled to Germany, Austria mainly, and Italy, places like that. From something like 140,000 churches in France, eventually went down to 150 that were operating. The clergy were told that they had to take an oath of loyalty to the new government. Half of them did and half of them didn't. And those that did became civil clergy and were paid a stipend by the government, but most people wouldn't go to their masses. Then you had the clergy in hiding, a bit like the English ones under Elizabeth, who would have masses in barns and so on, and if they were discovered, they were executed. It was bitter. And that's the thing that is a lead-up to Chevalier. One of the myths was that if you wore a badge of the Sacred Heart, bullets couldn't hit you. Well, that helps to sell them. And the church is now caught up in loyalty to the king, who's gone, executed, because of all this. They can't trust him. And the revolution now is taken over by increasingly not so much anti-church, so that'll come, it's more anti-clerical. They hated the bishops, they hated the priests who lived in luxury while they had to battle. They particularly hated religious priests, who they thought were so lazy and did nothing. The canons in the chapters, who got a stipend for singing the office whenever they turned up, that sort of thing. I mean, you're looking at a church that was pretty corrupt. Ours, in comparison, is minor in that term, but it's got different corruption. I can remember reading, I'm leaving out the part about Napoleon, who draws France together, who focuses its attention outwards, who kills a generation of young men and is still worshipped. God help us. But they used to say that in any peasant house there were two pictures, one of Napoleon, one of the Sacred Heart. I mean, this image of Sacred Heart really got through to the common people. When the revolution eventually worked itself out, 1815, and they had to create peace and so on, priests were gone, churches were barns, often used as the Russians did. I don't know where they got this idea from, but I was looking at our church today and I thought, yeah, it's easy. Turned them into stables because they're big open spaces. You can put things down there for horses. And it makes another point as well, of course. So when the church tries to get back into order after 1815, their image is that they're the prodigal son. They've gone off. Give them time, they'll recognise they've done badly, they'll come back to religion and God and the church. After 20 years, nothing's happened. So they went out seeking them next as the Good Shepherd one. So Chevalier comes into this era of French history. That's what he's born into. Bleak in terms of Catholic Church. They thought they'd come back, they haven't. Now they've got to go out seeking them like the Good Shepherd. When Chevalier was growing up, I don't know, you probably know reasonably about his life and so on. He wanted to be a priest. They didn't have any money to become priests, so he became a bootmaker's apprentice. We tried to learn Latin and that sort of stuff. He went into the seminary because a family heard about it and provided the money. He went from the junior seminary to the senior seminary, where he was the oldie in the group. Our Dick Hillston. I can put it from our group. He was 6 years older than we were. He'd been out working. They also describe Chevalier as being grim in the seminary. He's doing it for God, and therefore it's got to be proper. And there's no way he's going to let anything interfere with that. Now, a bloke called Rob Bryan comes here for funerals sometimes. He was with us in the seminary. Dutch. I'm safe. Because he'd read that to be a priest was better than not to be a priest. Therefore, he would be a priest because that was a better thing to do. So he went to the seminary and went through the process of being good. He said one day he realised he didn't really want to be a priest. And he relaxed and left. And it's lovely to meet him here now. But it was a good one because it parallels, except for the ending of it, something of Chevalier's drive of himself. There's the energy to force himself to do what he felt he ought to do, but he didn't get any pleasure out of it. It was only when they were doing the pretty much last thing in the seminary, which was just an add-on on the Sacred Heart, that something clicked. And he was then described as being cheerful, fun to be with, because something had changed within him. And he talks about this later on. I mean, he writes the same book 30 times. And you have this awareness that God is not grim. God is not mean. God is not trying to catch you out, hiding behind the curtain and seeing whether you're going to come in and steal the last of the lollies that haven't been taken off the table. Gotcha! Now you go to hell. Ha ha! So that's the image most people had of God. And Chevalier grew through that, if I can call it that, and started to reshape his life. And he asked the bishop, could he go to Issoudun, which was considered the most irreligious town in the diocese. One of the images is of the men sitting outside the church on Sunday, mocking the people that were game to go. Within 2 years of his being there, he had 600 men at a procession, religious procession. That's an incredible impact. Against generations of practical atheism. So it was this Sacred Heart that it seemed to him was the key to opening up religion to the people. So that's where he decided to spread devotion to the Sacred Heart. He became, and he had a very supportive parish priest who let him run. Now, you're familiar with the stories of building the house and getting the money to build it, and the novena to Our Lady of the Sacred Heart and so on. They're part of our mythology. So he then decides to build a basilica to the Sacred Heart, and he's got to get money for it. So he prays for money and so on, and money starts to dribble in and he's able to build it. It's incredible. He then sets up Issoudun as a place of pilgrimage to the Sacred Heart. And he gets up to 20,000 people there on certain days. Remember, railways had just been invented, and that made an incredible difference. You could actually get there. And has a railway station. We all vouch for that. So what he's doing here is spreading what he calls devotion to the Sacred Heart. And he writes books about devotion to the Sacred Heart. And he invents the title of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart because the Catholic world expects there to be a Mary version of whatever's there as part of the devotion, because she's the gentler one and so on. How the Sacred Heart wasn't gentle, I don't know. But he uses the language of devotion, but his reality is a life dedicated to God's love and spreading it among people. In our terms, we'd say he had stumbled upon her heart spirituality. But that language was not used at that stage and won't be used till probably the 1960s. We still, in my youth, talked about devotion to the Sacred Heart. And we did the 9 First Friars, we did all that. But we didn't talk about heart spirituality. We didn't know what that meant. We didn't have a spirituality. We had fear. It was much more fun. Where you were frightened all the time of being suddenly hooked by God and punished. but I haven't been to Mass. I can remember being in a fug for quite some time. It was Sunday Mass, and I was my young brother, and he was as slow as a wet week. And so I got in the front, went up the front door of the church and worked your way through and so on. There were blokes all standing around the edges, of course. And they were within the offertory. Okay. It was serious sin if you missed any of the offertory, the consecration and the priest communion. And you went to hell. Now, where does the church begin? Had he begun the offertory when I was in the portico? Because it took time to get through to see what they were up to. Now, I decided it must have been true, because I was good. But you can see the sort of nonsense you lead into? Whereas, you'd say today, well, lucky you were there for part of it anyhow. That was good to see. So what we're in at the moment is this transition period from one image of God and church to another. Some say we're in the second axial period, just beginning it, when we're going to move from organised religion and so on into much more small community-based stuff and so on. But we're certainly moving from a church of rules and order to a church of relationship. I love that phrase from Francis the other day. If you get a letter from what was the Holy Office, I've forgotten what they call them now, he says, don't take it too seriously. I mean, we've lived with this dreadful concept of orthodoxy, which grew out of Nicaea more than anywhere else. And it's been confirmed and confirmed and confirmed and confirmed. So religion's been assenting to, what do you call the things? Propositions. It's got nothing. I mean, it was good to see in John's recent letter that a gracious living is far more important. So if Francis is signalling a change from that dreadful hounding of theologians, because if you're going to play that game, you can't progress. All you can do is agree with what's been agreed on. Exciting. Look at our theological textbooks we had when we were kids. They were dead boring. It's not until you grow up out of that obedience that you start to touch something about the energy of God. And then you start to come up with very different ways of imaging God and talking about God. But that's part of our personal growth as well as our group growth. Currently, the word spirituality is very fashionable. Everyone is spiritual. I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And you get away with that then. If you say religious, you're out there. But they're not looking in churches for meaning. They're looking to, what's the phrase Paul used, is it? They will make to themselves thingos with, the itching ears was the one I liked in that phrase. It's the old translation of it. And that's what people are doing. They're looking for meaning and finding something that, as someone wrote the other day, it suits them, but it doesn't drive them to do anything for people. And that's probably its real weakness, And there's a suspicion of church traditions, particularly keeping them obedient, which was a powerful tradition for at least 1,000 years, but probably goes for 1,700. So, Roma lacuta est, something finita est, causa finita est. Rome has spoken, the job's all over. Finished. That was Augustine, God bless us, I think. But who was that English Catholic last century, a century before now, who wanted to sit down to breakfast every morning with a new letter from the Pope telling him what to believe this day. It wasn't Chesterton. Belloc it might have been. Someone like that anyhow. So we don't want that sort of obedience. We want creative disobedience, much more so. And the other one that sullied the church is obviously the sexual cases. Why would you listen to a church that's done all that? This is not irrational, this is just a gut thing. Doesn't matter what else they've done. So we have to live through that, which is hard, as all of us know. But if we want to remain in church, we want to be active, not passive. And that's parallel to civil society. We want a personal autonomy, we want personal conscience, we want personal judgment. And Rana says that today to be Christian you need to be a mystic. Not just a follower, not just someone who gets the head office to give you the rules for today. Religion has to be within you. If you like, it has to be heartfelt, which is giving it away a bit. There's also the other rejection by what I call the Atheist Club. It's interesting, I go into bookstores today and you don't see too many of their books. Perhaps that fashion's gone for a bit. Nothing new about it. You go back to Celsus and the others, the year 240 or so, with objections against Christianity. But they put up the what I think is quite spurious and silly, science versus religion. And that's been answered by pretty well every intellectual who's been around. But you've got to get it answered to the people, not just to us. They look upon science as all good, calm, rational. Science is nothing like that. And religion is emotional, results in evil, wars, intolerance, ignorance. There's a book about that, I've forgotten what it's called. All bad comes from religion. I've forgotten what that thing is. So you ask yourselves, or you say reject the God of the Bible, they reject Yahweh, and they look at all the silly stories about Yahweh. But if you know how to read the Bible, you enjoy the stories. It's got nothing to do with our understanding of God today. This is the way the Jews understood it 1500 BC, as it were, as everyone else understood it parallel. Enjoy them. Learn how to interpret it. So how they can be... It's interesting, isn't it? Most of the scientists who have no trouble with religion are the physicists and the chemists. Those who have problems with religion are generally the biologists. I think that's a safe enough generalisation, because physicists probably wouldn't really consider them scientists. So you might ask yourself what religion is being rejected. The God of punishment, the magic and that sort of stuff. The flat earth theology, if you like. I was at Chevalier about a year or two ago, chatting to one of their teachers who grew up with the God of brimstone and fire. What blew him was his first Sacred Heart Day. He'd never seen anything like it. Here was a community celebrating a loving God who frees them and encourages them to be themselves. Wow, never heard of that before. So how do you get that message to people when they are suspicious of the church, by and large? I suppose our advantage is we have lots of schools. That helps. But then they've got to grow up and they don't realise what... So we all have our search for meaning, search for connectedness, which we try to live out. God bless us. We want to go below the surface for friendship, acceptance, and this is where heart spirituality begins. It begins in this hunger for being accepted by God and energised by God and bringing that energy to others. And that goes right across everything you do. It's not just a devotion which is held on a certain time and day and place, which is easy to corral. But it's a way of understanding God. We have come to believe in God's love for us, which is actually the central message of the Old Testament, but don't tell most fundamentalists that. Especially the prophets. And that easy phrase in the New Testament, God is love. Well, it's easy to say. We know of our own resistance to the call. You familiar with your lizard brains? You are, but you don't know it, that's all. This is the evolutionary story, where if you go back 14-point-something billion years, they can almost date it. They can almost get to within a hundredth of a second of it. It's fascinating. They can't get to it. They do, I'm not sure what happens. Where matter just happened at an incredible rate. And you can run through, it's quite fun, the development of that from raw helium and hydrogen and so on into more complex chemicals, into bonding together, into huge galaxies and stars, into the Milky Way, way out over here, with suddenly billions of them over there, and that's us, right over on the corner. And within that galaxy, eventually a sun emerges. Things spin out of it, and they don't get away from its orbit. And you have about 7 or 8 of these, what we call planets, the wanderers. And one of these, call it miraculously, whatever, ends up creating life. They talk about it coming out of a storm that went for several million years. You'd think you're in Hamilton, sorry. And out of that came life, which was also endowed with this energy of evolution. And so you get the little troglodytes. And out of the troglodytes it keeps going to the more complex, until eventually you get anima bubbles that can come out and breathe. Some of them flee back in and they become whales and so on. And then eventually, as you're familiar with it, you start to get lizards, you get mammals, you get monkeys, and then you get what we call human beings, the last 300,000 years, or whatever you're going to 1.5 million, whatever you're going to measure, it doesn't matter much. But in what's later is often the remnants of what was earlier. And so we have still part of us, our lizard brain, which influences us. It had a lizard had only 3 operations it was interested in: food, security, sex. Hey, does that sound a bit like original sin? That's the experience. We don't deny the experience of wanting things and me in the centre. But don't go back to Adam and Eve. We got a different myth. That was the myth they used because they had no better. That's fine, I've got no quibble with that. It's a beautiful one, the way they use it at times. But be able to use it and float out of it and use the other one that's around. And then you've also got part of the mammal brain, and you've got part of the monkey brain, and you've got a human one in the front, all mixed in with whatever's up there. So, Jesus lived his humanity fully, we believe. He felt love, anger, pain, fear, powerlessness, loneliness, compassion, you name it, even humour. Marty was saying the Mass here this morning, he was determined to bring humour into it. Remember, what was the name of the rose, is it? Whether Jesus laughed or had a sense of humour. But Marty used it today with the idea of the master coming back and the servants who stayed up, that he would actually sit them to dinner and serve them. Imagine the people laughing at that. Oh, what a beauty. Well done, Big J, well done. What a story. But it makes the point. So, the stories and the involvement of Jesus then comes from the action parables, things like the lost sheep and so on, give us images of a loving God who leaves the safe ones back there and plunges into the bush to rescue the twit that was wandering out somewhere else. Well, that's very different from the old Yahweh figure. So if this is what Jesus felt, we're conscious, we feel the same things. This is our journey of our heart as we start to grow. We start to feel empathy for people. We start to feel fear. We feel compassion. We feel danger, all sorts of things. And we're conscious that whatever it is to be human, Jesus had that, we have it. From the nastiest feelings. Remember, I could have murdered my sister once. I had a surge of energy. I wasn't going to do it. But it means you know that you can actually feel it. You're no different from anyone else. Exodus, take out the heart of stone, put in a heart of flesh. It's no longer I who live, it's Christ who lives in me. Come to me, all you who are weary. My burden is light. We want to be permanently plugged into God, not just occasionally, not just on an hour on Sunday, not just so we don't go to hell. It's living in a world created by an outburst of energy and love that we want to be part of and help direct it. And so religion is lived not as a head trip, but a response in feelings to an understanding heart, a listening heart that understands me and wants me to be reshaped in the energy of Jesus as the image of God. As someone used this morning, the blueprint. So we're called upon to create the kingdom of God. No wonder they executed Jesus. He's talking about a kingdom of equality, of sharing equally, and he's saying this to the high priest, who owns half the land and has no intention of giving it back. And he's in cahoots with the big kahuna, Pilate as the representative, who drags taxation out of this country like nothing else. Why does he want to give it up? So anyone like Jesus was seen as a threat to public order. And if you're in the context, they'd had lots of threats to public order. You've had people being messiahs again and again and again and again. You've had the army coming in and wiping them out. But there's this bubbling energy, particularly in the Galilee, that just won't sit still. And my assumption is that Jesus lived a pretty tough life in Nazareth and understood from the inside what persecution and whatever was. Reflected in some of the sayings, particularly sift through Mark, where it's less edited. Where can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's one. I like that one. That's a good one. It's as though a Nobel Prize winner came from Quilpie. I mean, come on. They just don't come. Sometimes they do. But here you have one of the finest intellects I think the world's ever seen. Come out of a bush town of about 200 people living in one-room huts. No one had ever been schooled. There was no, what do you call it? Synagogue in Nazareth, Pache Luke, who makes one up for it. The odds are he couldn't read and write. Where did he get this knowledge from? I mean, it's incredible. No wonder they wanted to kill him. He just made them all look stupid. He didn't mean to. So you can read back and you look at things like the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy, of the stories of Jesus being bullied. They're put into little stories, but it probably echoes something of that. So it's nothing that, knowing ourselves, he hasn't done. So this love sends us out then on a mission. If we've understood this and it's meant a deal to us, then we want to share it. And so we, Chevalier, sent them out into the surrounds of France to preach the love of God for people. I'm trying to think of, it was a comment by one of our blokes giving missions about the 1930s. We had a lot of blokes on the mission staff. And the comment of the woman, she'd never heard of God as love before. It was just mind-blowing. So when we look at the heart centre, we don't rely on Margaret Mary, Pache Margaret. We rely upon the tradition of the church and all that stuff that goes with it. She created a little spike, if you like, of popularity because it touched a nerve. She helped to popularise and shape a devotion. But the ways of our living our religion have overtaken the idea of devotion. If you're in the Franciscan one, you would be simplicity and at one with nature. If you're in the Dominican one, it would be an understanding of the ways of God. So there are different spiritualities. You think of them, if you like, as different coloured glasses that shape the way you see the world. All adequate, all do a good job. This is, like Audrey, a poor thing but our own. So Vatican II had the opportunity to reshape the church. And you know, it may even happen again. But that was then white-anted, probably the best phrase, by people who couldn't cope with freedom and investigation and going where it takes you. They wanted the railway lines because they'd always had the railway lines. That was a church they knew. And they were terrified of this church that was coming out of nowhere and going who knew where. So while Vatican II opened that, and some of us have nostalgic memory of that, we've had to fight against the conservatives, if you like, within our own communities. How to live a human life in a tough world. Nicola manum alienum mihi, as we all say every night. Nothing human is foreign to me. More we've experienced hurting, and I think Jesus is in the middle of that, the greater our compassion can be. The emphasis of Catholic moralists from the 17th century was knowledge and duty. Today we look for heart, empathy, freely given, can't be forced. The period of being an established church, please God, is forever gone. When Constantine offered power to the bishops, they should have run for the caves. Interesting, when the church got power, it was the beginning of the monks. Those who left the organised, becoming powerful church and went into the bush to live a simple life. I don't think it's an accident. So we're familiar with our recent experience. We go from commitment to the people to commitment to the universe. It's all part of God's children. And this, we now see ourselves not just as healing a fallen, no, don't use the word fallen, an emerging human community, but healing the damage we've done. Looking at the unity of all peoples as what God wants in Christ. And this then gives us an energy and a drive into the indefinite future. There could even be other creatures in the universe. Who knows? Who cares at one level? It would take us so long to see them and take them so long to see us, it doesn't matter. If you take the old image of Jesus ascending into heaven, take it out of the three-tier universe, put it into the expanding universe, after 2,000 years he still wouldn't be out of the universe, even travelling at the speed of light. Which helps you to see mythology in a different light. So the challenge for us is to live in harmony with each other, with creatures, with everything. And that ain't easy, particularly as funnel webs have come out early this season. I don't know what role they have in creation. They will have one. There was one in Tablet recently about midges and whether they serve any role in creation. Because all she does is get bitten by them. She can't see how they give glory to God, but she'll hold until someone can explain it to her. Oh yes, I mean, when God created prawns, he did a really good job. Why God created broccoli, I have no idea. It's okay, some like it, I won't quibble.
Yeah, what was your statement there about the
That's a shift from commitment to the human community, which until recently was the only one we really thought about while we pillaged the earth. Now we realise that they's all God's children. And the purpose of creation is to bring people to a conscious involvement in creating unity, which we're not real good at the moment. Okay?
Other words can we add to it?
Right.
Deeply knowledgeable, and it's wonderful.
Sometimes things just connect at the moment.
Well, you know, I don't care how
That's
it happens.
fine,
But we're the lucky recipients of it. We don't mind when or where it connects, but my take on it would be a lifetime of scholarship, a lifetime of thinking, an openness to irony and paradox.
I love irony.
And out it comes, and we're the lucky recipients.
Thank you.
So thank you. And this might just provide a little bit of fodder for next year's.
Oh, good.
For next year's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
I remember years and years ago, Denis, some child saying to you that you were sarcastic, and you were greatly offended and saying never sarcastic, often ironic.